Zoe being the pride of her family, the girl who left to chase a degree in business administration. But the reality of life had slowly drained her optimism. The calls from her landlord had grown more threatening, her tuition fees were overdue, and her younger brother had just messaged her, begging for money to cover their mother's hospital bills. It was one thing after another. She stared at the cracked screen of her phone, scrolling through messages, job listings, and the occasional notification from her bank balance, $3.44. One evening, as Zoe sat in a cafe near campus, nursing a single cup of coffee she couldn't afford, she overheard a conversation at the next table. Two girls, impeccably dressed and dripping with confidence, whispered about a man named Mr. Mike. He slurred, one of them said, her manicured nails clicking against her phone. You just need to be open-minded. He pays well. Desperation clouded Zoe's judgment. She jotted down the name and number they mentioned and found herself dialing it later that night. Mr. Mike was everything the rumors described, suave, intimidating, and reeking of wealth. He picked Zoe up in his sleek black car, the leather seats cool against her skin. He didn't ask many questions, nor did he explain much. They drove to his mansion on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling estate that seemed out of place amidst her struggles. Over drinks in his lavish sitting room, he finally spoke. I help people like you, Zoe, he said, swirling his glass of whiskey. But nothing comes for free. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? Her throat tightened. She thought she was prepared, but his tone carried an edge that unsettled her. Still, the images of eviction notices and her mother's frail figure in a hospital bed propelled her forward. She nodded. Mr. Mike leaned back, studying her. There's a condition. An unusual one. If you agree, you'll never have to worry about money again. What kind of condition? Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smacked, as if enjoying her unease. You'll spend the night with my dog? Fully? No questions asked. The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. Your dog? Mr. Mike didn't flinch. You said you were desperate. This is the price. Zoe sat frozen, her thoughts spiraling. She could walk away, her dignity intact, but that meant returning to the suffocating weight of her financial burdens. Every logical part of her screamed to run, but desperation silenced the protest. Minutes passed before she whispered, How much? $20,000. Tonight, cash. The sum was staggering, enough to cover her tuition, her rent, and her family's needs. Her hands trembled as she nodded, her mouth dry. Mr. Mike stood, his expression unreadable. Follow me. He led her through a dimly lit corridor to a room at the far end of the mansion. Inside, a large, well-groomed Doberman sat on a plush rug. The dog looked up at her, its dark eyes unreadable. Zoe's stomach churned, but she forced herself to step inside. You have 1 hour, Mr. Mike said, before closing the door behind her. Alone in the room, the weight of her decision crushed her. Tears welled up, but she wiped them away. She couldn't afford weakness now, not when everything was at stake. The air in the room was thick with an unbearable silence. Zoe stood there, her back against the door, unable to move. The Doberman tilted its head, almost as if it were assessing her. She felt a wave of shame ripple through her, so profound that it made her knees weak. Her mind raced, torn between self-loathing and survival. I can't do this, but what choice do I have? The thought looped endlessly. She tried to focus on the reasons she had agreed to this, the mounting debts, her family's dire situation, the future that seemed to be slipping further out of reach with every passing day. Her body trembled as she slowly stepped forward. The dog remained calm, its gaze fixed on her. She couldn't bring herself to even think about what was expected of her. It was a boundary she never imagined she'd be forced to cross. Her thoughts drifted to her younger brother. She remembered his excitement when she had first left for university, the way he'd bragged to the neighbors that his sister would make their lives better. She thought about her mother's frail voice on the phone, apologizing for being a burden. The tears she had held back finally broke free, streaming down her face. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands. What am I doing? She whispered to herself, her voice shaking. For a long time she stayed like that, hunched over on the floor, battling the storm inside her. Every fiber of her being rebelled against what was expected of her. But the image of Mr. Mike's smirk lingered in her mind. He knew how desperate she was. He knew she would struggle, but he also knew she wouldn't walk away. The dog shifted, breaking her train of thought. Its movement startled her, and she scrambled back, her heart pounding. It padded closer, its presence a stark reminder of the decision she had to make. She closed her eyes, trying to still herself. She thought of her landlord banging on her door, her professor's disappointed face when she couldn't pay her tuition, and the helplessness in her brother's voice. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Zoe took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand. She wiped her face with trembling hands, trying to muster the strength to go through with it. She told herself it was just one moment, one night, and she would never have to think about it again. But as she reached out, a surge of nausea overtook her. She recoiled, stumbling back to the corner of the room. Her body betrayed her, trembling violently as she gasped for air. I can't do this," she choked out, her voice breaking. She sank to the floor again, clutching her knees to her chest. The dog watched her silently, its calm demeanor contrasting sharply with her turmoil. For a moment she wondered if it could sense her anguish, if it understood the depth of her despair. The minute ticked by, and Zoe felt the crashing weight of time slipping away. Mr. Mike's voice echoed in her mind. 1 hour. She felt trapped, caged by her desperation and the impossible choice before her. Her hands dug into her thighs as she tried to steady herself. Every part of her screamed for an escape, but there was none. She had willingly walked into this nightmare, and now she had to see it through or face the consequences of living empty-handed. As the hour drew closer to its end, Zoe was left with nothing but the deafening roar of her own thoughts, each one more damning than the last. Zoe sat motionless, her breathing shallow, as the weight of her decision bore down on her. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the reality of what she had agreed to turn in her stomach. She glanced at the door, wondering if she could simply walk out, but the thought of facing Mr. Mike, of admitting defeat, paralyzed her. The Doberman sat a few feet away, still as stone, watching her with an almost unnerving calmness. Its eyes were dark, unreadable, but not menacing. It was just an animal, unaware of the twisted expectations that had been placed upon it. Zoe's thoughts spiraled. What would people say if they knew? Would anyone even understand? Would they blame me for being desperate, or would they judge me as something less than human? The thought of her family finding out, of her brother looking at her with disappointment, made her chest tighten. The minutes ticked by. The silence in the room, broken only by the faint sound of the wind rustling outside the windows. Zoe stood, pacing the room in frantic circles. Her mind fought itself, torn between the crushing shame of going through with it and the unbearable consequences of walking away. She crouched down again, her hands pressed to her temples, trying to drown out the storm of thoughts. It's just one night, one act, and then it's over. I can fix everything. She whispered this mantra over and over, as though saying it enough times would make it true. But then a small voice, buried deep within her, whispered back, "And what happens to you after? What happens to your soul?" Her pacing slowed, her breath hitched. For a moment she stood still, staring at the dog. She didn't see an escape or an opportunity anymore. She saw a mirror of her own entrapment, another creature in this world without a say in its fate, without control. The door opened suddenly, startling her. Mr. Mike stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, then at the untouched scene before him. His smirk returned, colder this time. "I see you're struggling," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Perhaps I overestimated you." Zoe stood frozen, unable to respond. He walked closer, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoing in the tense silence. "It's a simple transaction, Zoe. You need money. I have it. You agreed to this." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her chest tight. He tilted his head, his tone softening just slightly. "No one will ever know. Your life will go back to normal. Isn't that what you want?" Zoe's hands clenched into fists. She hated the way he spoke, the way he made it sound so easy, but she hated herself more for even considering it. And then, something inside her snapped. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Mr. Mike raised an eyebrow, surprised. "No, I can't do it," she said, louder this time. "I won't." His smirk faded, replaced by a look of mild irritation. "Are you sure? Walk out of here, and you get nothing. No second chances." She took a deep breath, her body shaking but her resolve firm. "I don't care. I'd rather face my problems than live with this for the rest of my life." For a moment, Mr. Mike stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged, stepping aside to let her pass. "Suit yourself." Zoe hesitated, her legs weak as she walked past him and out of the room. She didn't look back. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she stepped outside the mansion. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't just tears of despair. They were tears of relief. She didn't know what awaited her back in her cramped apartment, didn't know how she'd face her landlord, her school, or her family. But she knew one thing: she still had herself. The heavy oak door of the church creaked open, and Zoe stepped inside, the cool air of the sanctuary wrapping around her like a blanket. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above. The high ceilings, the stained glass windows, the quiet dignity of the pews, all of it felt alien to her now. It was as though she'd wandered into a world too pure for the shame she carried. She had made up her mind long before she arrived. She had to speak to someone. There had to be some form of redemption, some place where her soul could begin to heal. The weight of what she had almost done clung to her like a second skin, suffocating her, turning every breath into a struggle. Zoe hesitated at the back of the church, taking in the solemn atmosphere. She wasn't a regular churchgoer, but there had been moments in her life when she had prayed, when she had believed that God would guide her. Now more than ever, she needed that guidance. She approached the altar slowly, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. There, kneeling in prayer at the side, was Reverend Father Thomas, his eyes closed in quiet devotion. She cleared her throat softly, unsure of how to begin, but the Reverend's eyes opened as he turned to face her, his expression warm yet serene. "Child, come forward," he said gently, gesturing to the seat beside him. His voice was comforting, like a balm to the rawness she felt inside. Zoe sat down beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The Reverend watched her with quiet patience, as though he could see the storm raging within her. "Father," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've come because I don't know what to do anymore." The Reverend nodded, his gaze steady, kind. "God listens to those who seek him with an open heart, Zoe. Speak freely. What burdens you?" She swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in her throat. She had never imagined she'd be here, confessing the depth of her struggles. The words came out in a rush, spilling from her lips like a flood she couldn't control. "I'm lost," she said, her voice cracking. "I made a choice, a horrible choice, because I was desperate. I did something unforgivable. She stopped herself, tears welling up in her eyes as the weight of the memory crushed her chest. The Reverend's hand gently rested on hers. "You are not alone in your pain, my child. Continue. Let it out." The floodgates opened. Zoe's voice faltered as she told him everything: the mounting debts, the pressure to succeed, the promise of money from a man named Mr. Mike, and the twisted request he had made. Her body shook with the release of every word, each one a jagged shard of her brokenness. "I almost went through with it." Further, she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut as she relieved the agony. "I almost spent the night with his dog for money. I thought it was the only way out. I was so broken, so desperate, I thought there was no other way." The Reverend remained silent, his hands still resting on hers, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her confession. "I almost did something I can't take back. I thought I could buy my freedom, my family's freedom, but all it did was trap me more. I feel like I've lost everything. My dignity, my soul. How could I even ask for forgiveness for something like that?" Father Thomas did not answer immediately. He let the silence hand between them, allowing her to feel the depth of her words, the weight of her confession. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Zoe, my child, you are not defined by your mistakes. Desperation can lead us down dark paths, but it does not make you evil, it makes you human. And you have the power to change, to rise from this. Forgiveness comes from the heart, not from perfection." His words struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had been running from herself, from the pain and guilt that had consumed her, and she had forgotten the truth that had once brought her comfort, the truth that even in our darkest moments, God offers grace. "I don't know how to forgive myself," she whispered, her voice small, fragile. Father Thomas gently lifted her chin, meeting her eyes with a tenderness she hadn't expected. You start by believing that you are worthy of forgiveness. You begin by accepting that you are human, and God sees you, even in your darkest hour. You do not have to carry this burden alone, Zoe. Let go of the shame, for it has no place in the heart of a child of God. Her chest heaved with emotion, a sob escaping her lips. She had been so afraid of losing everything, afraid of the consequences of her choices. But now, in the safety of the church, in the presence of a man who did not judge her, she allowed herself to feel the one thing she had been too afraid to embrace: hope. I don't know how to start over, she whispered through her tears. Father Thomas smiled gently. One step at a time, my child. That's all it takes. One step toward healing, toward peace, and you will find it. Zoe nodded, her heart heavy yet lightened by the weight of his words. She didn't know what the future held, or how she would face her challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest flicker of possibility. Thank you, she said, her voice shaky but sincere. I feel lighter. I think I can breathe again. You are always welcome here, Zoe. And remember, God's love never abandons you, no matter where you've been. As she stood to live, Zoe felt a shift within herself. She didn't have all the answers, she didn't have all the solutions, but she had something now that she had almost lost: her belief that she could still find redemption. One step at a time. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell notification for more stories like this, and give this video a thumbs up. Click on this next interesting story.